What's up? This is Rebel Radio.
What up? What up? This is DJ Newmark.
This is Peanut Butter Wolf.
It's your boy. It's okay.
Keep checking out Rebel Radio.
Rebel Radio.
This is Rebel Radio.
We're in the place right here. Rebel Radio is going down.
Would you say Rebel Radio?
Oh, wait. Let's do it again.
Rebel Radio.
What's up, Rebels? Welcome back to Rebel Radio, the weekly show where I bring you the rebels who are shaping our culture. We talk about how they do it, why they do it, and what you can do to get a little piece of the pie for yourself. We're also the only show to bring you new music every week from our friends over at EDM.com. I'm your host, Josh Levine. Check it out, y'all. It's Grammy Week. If you're in LA, there's party after party. I know you're probably turned up and listening to this with a hangover. We got an interesting guest this week. My man John Lewis came through the studios. John's not a typical kind of guest that we would have. Actually, when they called me about him, I thought he was the civil rights pioneer who marched on Selma with Dr. King. Happy Martin Luther King Day to everybody listening. But he's not that John Lewis. John is a really interesting guy that I got to know on the mic for all of you. He's you might describe him as kind of a corporate guy. He's worked at Nike, he's worked at Burton, he's had big marketing jobs, but he's definitely not a corporate guy once you dig under the surface with him. He's also an entrepreneur, building a coffee brand. What I really liked about John is passionate about motorcycles, not just that he likes to ride them, he wants you to ride them. And he uses his voice on social media, on Medium, to talk about riding motorcycles, talk about the motorcycle industry, to educate, persuade. He's doing all the things that we want somebody to do to bring their passions to life. And we got some great lessons from him coming up on the show. Let's get into it right after the EDM.com track of the week. That was Stribo with Plan, the EDM.com track of the week. If you like that one, get over to the EDM.com, check out more new music. And right now, let's get into the interview with John Lewis. Here, every 20-minute thoughts, which one that comes up?
Well, everybody's going to ask me some questions.
I don't have to. We can meditate.
It's funny. I'm terrible at that too. I'm not even trying to answer that question, but I'll answer it by not answering it. In a job interview once, somebody asked me, like, what is the job you really wanted to have in this world? Like, what is the one thing you really wanted to do? Yeah. And I'm like a Jewish kid from upstate New York. My entire life, I've always wanted to be a professional soccer player.
Oh wow!
I remember opening up Sports Illustrated. And there were no athletes for you to look up to when you were a kid. If you were a soccer athlete, right? I mean,
right.
There's no MLS.
Yeah, Pele.
Pele.
Right.
That was it.
Sure.
So I went to soccer camp at Cornell University, and they opened up every single camp with like this 30-minute Pele video that was paid for by Pepsi. I actually found him on YouTube recently. Yeah. And I just remember it all talked about in Brazil. We are all about football, and I'm like. I grew up in a household where my dad watched the Giants, and I always wanted to be a soccer player. I played youth soccer, and I decided that when I was in high school that I wanted to be a professional soccer player.
Nice. That
didn't exactly happen for me.
Yeah.
First of all, I wasn't that great. I played in college a little bit. That didn't work out very well for me either. This is a really inspiring talk about where all the places I failed. If this were a podcast about failure, and I will talk a lot about failure today, I am masterful at swinging the bat and going down and swinging. Like, I think failure is like one of the most important things you can do as you go through this, this process that we call life.
Well, I definitely want to talk about that because I think it's, it's on everyone's minds. There's this narrative right now in society about failure and what it means and learning. And, sometimes I wonder, like, how much is that really changing people's attitudes?
Well, our entire culture now is defined by people's success.
Exactly.
You're 20 whatever years old. Everyone calls himself an entrepreneur. This is a podcast about being an entrepreneur, so you know this probably better than anybody. The kids all need to have a $4 million valuation before they even like figure out like what product they even have.
Right.
And it seems like if you don't know what to do with yourself or what to call your life, you just call yourself an entrepreneur.
Sure.
And I have entrepreneured. We'll talk about a lot of that entrepreneuring stuff that I've done. And you're making up so much stuff as you go along. You really have to have big fucking stones to be an entrepreneur. The role that sort of even brought me in here today to talk about part of what we'll get into is, I'm in a non-entrepreneurial role at the moment that is highly entrepreneurial. Meaning I get I have a paid salary by a company to come in and figure shit out.
Right.
I'm really good at doing that. So I don't mind taking the money and taking the time to like help out other brands and other people. But I won't do it. I mean, like, I worked at Nike for a bunch of years, and I'm not gonna sit here and slam a $28 billion company, but there's not one person that sits in that desk at that company that has one entrepreneurial cell in their body, because you work at Nike, right? I mean, you could take a bag of glass and put a swoosh on it. You'll probably sell a couple million of them.
I imagine they have.
Yeah,
Probably with Supreme.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, actually, that's a perfect example. When Supreme did that brick about a couple of years ago, everyone was like taking a swipe at it. I'm like, this is like the best idea I've ever heard, where these guys are actually sort of like taking the piss out of themselves now.
Sure.
All right, but we're talking about being an entrepreneur. But it feels to me like the spirit of being an entrepreneur has been completely whitewashed in our sort of 21st century digital, millennial, whatever. What are all the modifying adjectives you'd throw into our current culture? It seems like it's made very glamorous.
Sure.
I just read. Have you read Phil Knight's book? Or I'm sure you know.
Shoe Dog?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You read that one.
Yeah.
So you don't even have any idea how many times that guy like almost shat the bed with that company.
Yeah.
I worked there for a bunch of years. As you walk into the main entrance of Nike, there's this beautiful like sort of like Japanese rock water garden, and the rocks represent the rocky path of the start of the company. And I'm like, oh, what a great story. And then I'd walk over it every day, going to my desk with my salary job and my 401k and all that stuff. I knew what Phil had done, but I had no idea, no fucking clue how many times that guy almost flamed out and crashed that company. And what's also really interesting about it too is that Del Hayes was one of the founders of the company. I know a lot about it, having worked there, and they kind of brainwash you when you first get there.
Sure.
Del Hayes is one of the founders, as was Phil, and this guy named Rob Strasser. Rob Strasser really was kind of the architect of the marketing of that company. And forget about Phil. Phil was just a crummy long-distance runner, but both Del Hayes, who's I think the accounting mind, and Rob Strasser were both obese, non-athletic guys. And they had to make so many decisions. They had to make a decision, do we sign, if you can even believe this, do we put all of our marketing dollars behind the center named Patrick Ewing, or do we put all of our marketing dollars behind this third-round draft pick, Michael Jordan? I think I'm getting the numbers right here, but there were two guys picked before Jordan that year. Ralph Sampson from UVA. Yep. I forget the other guy. I wish I knew, it would help the story. And then obviously Jordan. Yeah. And the rest Ralph Sampson had a great career, but let's be honest, I can't even tell you the number two guy is. Right. So that was just really fascinating to me. Like, you think, oh, Phil made some shoes and he sold 5, then he sold 1,000, then he sold 20 million. But man, like, he made, by the way, he still lives in the same house that he bought when he first started Nike, which is also sort of an interesting story. But he made some gut-wrenching decisions that could have gone any number of ways at that time, on top of the fact that Adidas had like a nice 20 or 30 year head start on him, and was the premier sports brand at that time. And anyway, I also can talk for an entire 2 hours about like just the culture of working in a place like that. It's absolutely fascinating place. But what's also really interesting to note is like, you know, Nike has like this sort of huge cool factor on it. About 98% of the people who work in that company, I would say, aren't like the coolest people you've ever met.
Right.
It's just a well-organized machine, you know?
So let's talk about that for a minute. How does, you know, from the outside,
Yeah.
right? Nike's this cool brand.
Yeah.
They're, you know, they could not be more relevant to urban America and the you know, all of the various subcultures that are happening. But yeah, they're a big white company from Oregon, filled with a bunch of people who, as you say, are not entrepreneurs. They're not necessarily cool. And that runs counter to a lot of assumptions
Yeah.
about how we think about how success is achieved.
Yeah.
So what is it? How do they?
Yeah.
What's the secret?
Yeah, that's funny. So I'm a consultant by trade. I get hired, I would say 8 times out of 10, people hire me and bring me in to answer that exact question and basically to sprinkle that.
Well, tell us for free.
I'll tell you for free. There's a couple things at play on that. And first of all, you're right. You know, if you look at, I don't know what percentage-wise, what the percentage of people of color are in that company. And yes, there is a wide swath of
I think
people.
I know both of them.
You do? You know those numbers?
No, both of the people of color.
Oh, you do? You
Working
know,
at
you have
Nike.
2 friends that work there. Yeah, so there's a lot at play there. First of all, I would say, and this is sort of a long-winded answer to a pretty simple question. The first thing that is at play there is what I define as the most amazing thing that I took away from my 4 or 5 years there, is the relationship between Nike and Wieden Kennedy. So you probably, being that you're sort of in the music industry, I guess you're familiar with Wieden Kennedy, or
Sure.
know of them, yeah.
Yeah.
So Wieden Kennedy was founded just by 2 white guys from Oregon. That's
Right.
not really a very interesting story. When they started the agency, Dan Wieden actually hired people to come in and just like type on typewriters and stuff to show Phil Knight that they actually had clients. They had none,
Sure.
you know, and I love
Yeah.
those kind of stories. And what's really interesting about that relationship is people always think that Nike's success, Nike's success is found in the fact that they make some pretty amazing product, and we can go into like what is behind the Air Force One and what is behind the Air Foamposite and all the technology and innovation, and when they launched shocks and how much went into that. Like, it's nuts, and I could again fill this whole room and add 2 hours of your life talking about that. But to me, it all comes back to the relationship between those 2 entities, between Phil Knight essentially and Dan Wieden of Wieden and Kennedy. And I always found it really interesting when, you know, in the marketing world, everyone thinks that, well, you take a piece of paper that's empty and you write words on it, and that's called a brief. And if you're good at it, you keep it to one piece of paper.
Yep.
And you hand it to a bunch of smart agency people, and they take that brief and they go back and they sit on it, or in the case of Wieden and Kennedy, probably smoked it, I would guess. And they come back and they just spit out, like, you give them a brief like, all right, what do we do with World Cup soccer? We need a big World Cup soccer idea. And here are our athletes, and here's a strategy. You know, like one strategy one year was, you know, this is for the Olympics, was sport is war minus the killing, right? Give us an ad campaign based on that simple philosophy. And then the agency comes back and they'll present you 4 or 5 ideas. One is just more brilliant than the next. And the part that happens on that side of the wall, like, what does Dan Wieden do to inspire these group of people? How does and I will also say, like, probably the most diverse group of people I've ever encountered in professional work environment was Wieden and Kennedy. So I would say one part of that success is that, as white as Nike may seem, that's something we were just talking about a second ago, I would say the opposite about the brands or the companies that attach themselves to Nike. So then you sit in this room and the agency spits out 5 ideas, one better than the next. And at the end of the meeting, it's like, okay, you know, we have to think about it, because that's what you do when you're the client. You have to think about things. It's really nice. Agency comes in, you drink a lot of coffee, and then you go back to your desk, and then you have meetings. Or at Nike, there's a big culture of, you know, sports. You'd go for a run, you'd play soccer at lunch, and you'd talk about stuff. But then at the end of the meeting, someone from Wieden and Kennedy would say, there's just one guy named Chuck McBride who works for an agency called Cutwater now. And Chuck was the king of doing this. He's like, hey man, you got a second? You're like, yeah, what's up? He's like, I keep thinking about this idea, and I know it's not, you didn't ask us for this, you didn't give us a brief, but I just keep thinking about this soccer idea that I have. And I'm like, well, what is it? And so he would pitch you this idea. This idea in particular he wanted to pitch was a kid who takes a soccer ball and then takes like a steak and then sort of squeezes a steak out over the soccer ball and then gives it to, and like sort of holds it in front of this dog's nose, and he starts dribbling the ball while the dog's trying to get the ball. I mean, it's a pretty simple idea, right? And I guess he had pitched it to someone else they didn't like it. He was looking for someone, an advocate within to sort of push this idea through. And so he chose me. And so to me, that was always like sort of the beauty of that relationship. And to answer your question, like why it was so successful, is that they are constantly thinking, Wine and Kenny, were always thinking about like how, like, their mantra was, it's all about the work. What is the biggest possible idea? And as simple or as complex as that idea must be, how can we as simply and efficiently communicate this without just getting past all the bullshit? And so part of getting past all the bullshit was to pick someone, I don't know if it was an advocate or maybe in my case the weak link, to take your pick of someone who would be like, yes, that is such a fucking good idea. And that ad actually ended up getting made. Yeah. And it didn't get made because I jumped up and down, but I did. And I took it to another person, and then there's a guy at the time named Tommy Kane who was running Nike Sports Marketing. I'm like, Tommy, we got to do this. And we were playing soccer one day, and I showed it to him. He's like, oh yeah, we got to do that. And that's how the good work got done. It wasn't a ton of meetings. It was all about, like I said, it comes back to that relationship. Like, I don't know how it started with Dan and Phil Knight, but whatever, 20 or 30 years later, I am sitting with this guy, Chuck, and we're trying to figure out, like, how do we get the best ideas to the top? And when you get hired by another company and they always want you, and I tell them that story, and they're probably in the same way any of the listeners are listening to this story, or maybe even you're like, that's the secret. The best ideas get made, that's it. But it's the process of getting it made, and it's like that tissue, that sort of connective tissue of between you and the agency that was like, it's so unique. And if you've ever worked around Wine and Kenny, they're a very, very, there's some really amazing creative people there, but as Dan will tell you, they're also the most insecure people on the planet, the creatives in ad agencies, Yeah. There's one guy in particular named Jim Griswold, who has since retired. He now is an artist. And he gave a speech at one of our conferences once. It was just the most fascinating talk I think I've actually done it for other people before. And I wrote him a note saying, hey, I have to go speak. I speak at Loyola Marymount sometimes. A friend of mine's a marketing professor there. Cool. And I said to Griswold, hey, can I borrow that speech? And like it's my own. Go and give it. And it's this great story. That's cool. That he told about. He made an ad. It was basically like a tennis ad of Instant Karma, using the John Lennon song Instant Karma. And the ad ran during a tennis match. And after the ad ran, everyone was like sending emails to Nike, and mostly it all gets directed at Nike, not so much Wine and Kennedy, saying, oh, the Beatles are a sellout, John Lennon's a sellout, why'd you guys sell this song? You're just being exploited, blah, blah, blah. And then Jim read this letter to our group saying, hey, I was watching the tennis match of, I think it was like Yvonne Lendl against somebody, I don't know, this is obviously a long time ago. I was watching the tennis match on Sunday, and that song came on, Instant Karma, and it really just touched my soul, and I am so proud to have known John Lennon, and it was such an amazing and beautiful moment. The ad ran at the exact perfect time. I just want to thank you for creating that moment, sincerely, Yoko Ono. Yeah. And when you hear stories like that, and you work in advertising, like you're making ads. At the end of the day, you're making ads. It's communication. It resonates with a certain amount of people, but at the end of the day, you're making ads. And sometimes you have to really reconcile that with what the fuck are we doing here? Like, what are we even doing on this planet? Just making ads. Like, is that all I'm doing with my life? And at Nike, it never felt that way. Right. It always felt like you're actually doing God's work, Well, I think, we're of a generation where ads were culture, right? And we think of these mega brands, we think of these ad campaigns that, that endure, for generations, or that really shaped, whatever. Like,
you know, like the one that always comes to mind is like "Don't squeeze the Charmin," right? Which is, you know,
Wow, you're really dating.
certainly dated, but for you know most of America at a given time, like they knew what that was about. You know, they had the visual memory, and it was, you know, it was a short bit of entertainment in between your shows, right?
Yeah.
It feels to me like that's over, and so I don't know. Am I wrong about that? I don't.
No. Well, yeah, you're wrong.
Okay.
You're wrong.
Good.
And I'll tell you why. I feel like now, you know, I keep thinking of that, you know, that expression, the media is the message, you know. You drive around LA and you see, first of all, like Apple's the most digital company on the planet. You see their billboards everywhere, so they still advertise in analog
Sure.
media, which I find that contrast really interesting. But I'll think of my favorite, one of my favorite brands. Well, I have two favorite brands. Everyone loves Apple as a brand, so I'm going to ignore that. But I look at it, and we're talking about advertising now. So one of my favorite brands is Trader Joe's. You know, they don't really do any ads,
Right.
but it's a very like sort of three-dimensional experience going to that store. And and the thing I really love most about TJ's, and try this out, try and find a person in that store who isn't stoked out of their mind about what
Right.
they're doing.
Yeah,
You know?
totally.
I don't know how they do it, but they do it.
Right.
So that's not an ad, but to me, like that's like I think brands have just reformulated themselves and found different ways to connect with consumers.
But that's kind of my point, right? Is that I think you're making an argument that brands are a culture or a part of culture or can be. And I think we certainly would argue that with Apple and Trader Joe's.
Well, I think brands certainly drive culture, you know.
Right. But it feels to me like advertising is not the medium for doing that anymore.
No,
and yet it still commands a huge chunk of the budgets and the energy and the.
But the good news now is that you can have relationships with brands, and
Right.
yes, Nike will do a 30-second ad. You'll watch the NBA Finals. It'll be with whatever. I didn't watch enough basketball to even. I mean, LeBron, I guess, would be the use example. And you see an ad with LeBron, it's super cool, and that's it. But what you also realize, we all realize, is if you go into YouTube, you get the 146-second version of that ad, and it goes into some whole story, and you learn a little bit about LeBron or whatever the story is supposed to be. But what I think is really interesting is that it's so much easier now to break the rules with the way marketing is designed now and the way it's conceived. And one of my favorite brands is Dollar Shave Club.
Okay.
And I always remember when that one came out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And it's the dude who...
Obviously, you're a customer. Like I am.
Yeah, I don't get around doing too much shaving in my spare time.
Same here.
Yeah, I do use it. As a matter of fact, it's funny, and if the Dollar Shave Club people are listening, I'm happy to do a sponsorship, because I had to put my membership on hold because I started stockpiling so many razors.
Oh, really?
You can see I don't use them very often.
Yeah.
But that was like a 2-minute like little ad they did. Do you remember this story?
Sort of.
It's the CEO of the company, and he had written comedy in like a previous life, so he just wrote this incredibly funny spot, taking the piss out of like whatever the other razor brands are. Schick, I guess, might be one of them. He took a swipe at he basically called it shave technology. And I watched enough TV to when you see they show the guy rolling the thing on his perfect face, and it shows you all the shave tech that goes into it, and you're like, this is complete fucking horseshit. Like, who believes in any of this stuff?
Right.
That was his angle on it. He basically just flipped the middle finger to in a multi-billion-dollar category. And by the way, he just sold that to Schick for I think $2 billion with a B.
Yeah.
So he did something right. And to me, I feel like those are the rules of marketing now. That the rules are there are no rules. Like, you create the platform, you create your own strategy. And now that we have this thing called media, we get to make our own media in our even what we're sitting here doing right now. Before, if we had to do this, you had to be on whatever K-Rock, and I don't know any LA radio stations. You have to be in like K-Rock in New York or LA, and you'd have to have a pretty fancy studio and have a antenna on the ceiling broadcasting. And now you and I just sit here and chop it up, and you'll edit this, hopefully make me sound really intelligent, which is going to be a really good challenge for you.
That's his job.
Oh, that's your job?
Yeah.
Good luck on that. And we can have this conversation, and the model has been totally flipped, and I find that really fascinating, you know. And brands that do that are the brands that I find resonate the most with me personally, and those are the brands that I really identify with, and the brands I like to work with. You know?
Yeah, so I guess what it feels like to me is that, you know, it is, with some exceptions, it is the Dollar Shave Clubs. It's these brands coming out of nowhere. It's the entrepreneurs, you know, who are making that happen. Whereas Schick and Bic and Gillette, with their, you know, endless resources, can't come up with anything that anybody wants to watch.
Right, and that's the reason why, you know, as a sort of a corporate marketeer of sorts, which is where I've spent most of my career, it's fun to first of all, it sucks working in companies like that. They can't get out of their own way. They can't. There's no one's ever going to go into a Schick whatever razor meeting and then say to the client, like, hey, I got an idea for you. Come here, and then give you the soccer ball example. You know, that is never going to happen. Those relationships don't exist. You know.
So what does that mean then when, you know, $1 trillion of our gross domestic product is wrapped up in these mega companies that have, on one hand, they have, you know, we would think of like all the power, and then on the other hand, none of them seem to be able to accomplish anything except for once in a while stepping in a pile of shit that gets them, you know, a ton of hate, and then they have to let someone go and start over, right? Like it feels like you got the Keystone Cops controlling most of the money, and then we have, you know, these entrepreneurial brands, whether it's Dollar Shave Club or Rihanna, coming out of nowhere and just wiping everybody up.
Right.
And again, I know I'm overstating that, but that's what it feels like, right?
And it's hard for me to give music examples because I'm so old school. I mean, I'll be like, well, the Rolling Stones had a really great album. But I think of Billie Eilish as one example.
Okay.
Like, to me, she seems like...
That's pretty current.
Yeah, that's about as current as I'm going to get.
Yeah.
And only because she was on Howard Stern recently, so I consume a lot of my media through that guy.
Okay.
And it's funny, I was listening to him as we were driving over here, and he just interviewed Hillary Clinton, apparently. I missed that. But on the way over here, he had Will the Farter on. And I'm like, wow,
That's range.
Amazing,
yeah.
Right? Like, to me, that type of contrast, to me, and let's talk about him as a brand.
We should put them on together.
But isn't that amazing?
Yes.
Here's a guy who is like, he moves culture, that guy.
Yeah, for sure.
Will the Farter and Hillary Clinton in like the same week, you know? Like that, I don't know any other media personality or brand who can create that type of reaction in people, you know?
Yeah.
And also, it's, you know, I was to brag for a second, this is as close as I got to the music industry. When I was in college 1,000 years ago, when they had this stuff called vinyl, and I think you remember that.
Of course.
I was a disc jockey on our college radio station, yeah. And so...
What'd you play?
Well, I was and am and probably always will be. There's two artists who have completely defined, I think, who I am and listen to this day, despite the fact that I'm sort of aging myself. With this Billy Bragg being one of them, who's just an angry white guy with a guitar trying to, like, you know, spread his socialist message. And then the artist that, like, just blew me into pieces as a teenager, Prince. You know, huge Prince fan.
Me too.
You are too, yeah. I remember buying my first album that wasn't Prince, but I remember seeing the Prince album in the store when I bought it. I bought Eagles, Hotel California.
Okay.
And then I remember seeing the Prince album and wondering about who that was, and I had an older brother who was 7 years older, and he kind of knew something about him.
Yeah.
And then I also remember the Dirty Mind album, which is the album cover was Prince in like a G-string underwear standing in front of a mattress, like a sort of stripped down mattress. And in the liner notes of that album was Prince in a shower. He was taking a shower wearing the same underwear. And so I took the liner notes out and I taped it into my closet in my room. So this is in the early 80s, I'm like 14 years old or so at the time. My parents never said one word to me about, hey, my mom would, you know, she'd call me Johnny. Johnny, like, why is there a man in his underwear? And she never asked the question, never brought it up. And I almost sort of like I can attribute my sort of, I like to think my sort of open-mindedness to the fact that he was the first person to show me, like, you can be a certain way in this world and actually be accepted, you know. But his music, like that.
I gave that poster to a girl that I liked.
Did you really? You know, you remember that poster? Right?
Yeah, I bought that album. It was my introduction to Prince, and I've told this story on the show before. But that it blew my mind, that record, and I went on I bought the record, played it to death, gave the poster to a girl, and then that Christmas my grandparents took me on a cruise down to Ensenada, and there was a disco in the bottom of the ship, and I was 10, but I had befriended this 16-year-old girl and got her
Nice
to
work.
got her to go to this disco with me, and they're playing Physical, Olivia Newton-John.
Sure.
On the, and so I walk up to the DJ, 10-year-old kid, not knowing any better. I'm like, hey, could you play Head by Prince? And the guy looks at me and he goes, who's Prince? Because it was 1980 and Prince hadn't broken yet. And like the DJ that would be playing a cruise ship in Mexico hadn't heard of Prince yet.
Right.
And I'm sure he was also just trying to get rid of me.
That's a great song. I hadn't thought about that song at all.
Oh, it's so good. I just read the Morris Day autobiography, which if you could carve out some time,
that's a good one. Huh?
It's so good.
I know that
it's new.
Oh, it is new because obviously it's timed as the same. I just was in an airport and saw that Prince's book finally came out.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And I read in the New Yorker. I didn't realize like he'd started writing the autobiography with the guy who ended up, and then he died like a month into it. So he actually wrote part of it.
Yeah.
But his handwriting's in there. I kind of flipped through. I mean, I'll read that book for sure. I didn't know Morris Day.
It's a cool book. They have this fictional conversation throughout the entire book. He's talking to Prince, but obviously putting words in Prince's mouth.
Right.
Kind of working out some of their issues, which was cool.
When I first saw Bruno Mars, I don't know where he came from, but to me, he just sort of came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
To me, it was Uptown Funk. That's like his big hit, right? That was Morris Day, man.
Yes.
That was straight
He got
up
sued over that.
Yeah. Oh, he did?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's a big lawsuit. Not just that, but yeah. Anyway, yeah.
All right, we can't spin out on Morris Day, but I will read that book though. Thanks
So
for
cool.
cueing me into that one.
So okay, so how do you go from that to being a DJ in college?
Oh yeah. Well, so what was I doing being a DJ in college? So, I made that connection as we were talking because when I was a senior in college, I went to New York City for the first time, sort of on my own, and lived on the Upper East Side with a kid who had graduated a year prior and did an internship at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, cool.
So in the morning, I'd listen to Howard and never heard. Come on, I'm from upstate New York. I went to college in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. You don't get exposed to really any new or interesting ideas. So when I first heard Howard for the first time, I was absolutely it was kind of like Prince, right? Mm-hmm. I'm now kind of like stringing it together. Like these people who have made an impact on my life are people who are just out there absolutely doing their own thing and not giving a rip about what people think about them,
Yeah.
So without going through my entire career, this internship, it's funny, I think my second week into this internship, I was working for the Virginia Slims Tennis Championship at Madison Square Garden, which is actually a big tennis property back in the day, which is funny to think that cigarette companies...
That's a women's tournament.
It's a women's tournament, right? You have a good memory, yeah. And on the second week, I was working for this really funny guy. They all got fired. So that was my first introduction into corporate America. Everyone got shit canned. And this guy on his way out the door basically said to me, hey man, as a favor, can you photocopy this entire book for me? This is back when we actually had to use Xerox machines. And so I did and I'm still friends with him to this day. As a matter of fact, we were friends on LinkedIn and I spoke to him on email the other day. So it's funny, you never have any idea who are these relationships you make in your life and how long you carry them with you. But what that did for me was I was just like a punk kid from upstate New York. So being in New York, I think it took me like a week or two to sort of get my shit together and navigate the New York subway system. And I'll never forget the moment when I was walking to the subway one day and a woman asked me for directions and I was able to give her directions. And that's cool. When you're whatever, like I think I was 20 years old, that's a big moment in your life. Like I still remember what she was wearing, what she looked like, And it's funny that stuff that stays with you for this amount of time. Yeah. But all it did was plant the seed that I needed to be in New York City. So I graduated college and moved to New York. And I would say that was probably like the greatest, 7, 8 years of my entire life. Living in New York City, again, dating myself. This is back when like Dinkins was mayor and Giuliani and
Yeah.
You know, you could get arrested, like when Giuliani came on, you could get arrested for like urinating in the streets because, you know, New York was just mayhem back then. It felt that way at least.
Sure.
They actually packed meat in the meat packing district. You know, it wasn't what I was just there last week.
Oh, it's all.
Oh man, it's
changed.
totally different. I had kind of a weird experience there, and at the end of it, I was just like, you know, I don't want to sit here and slam LA and say how great New York is. They both have their own thing going on. But even like a shitty day in New York is still like can be like a good day in your life, and a shitty day in LA always just feels like this is too much. I can't deal with it. I'm not a huge fan of LA, generally speaking, even though I live here.
Yeah.
What makes it tolerable for me, what makes it all work is, and you know, New York, you don't really need a vehicle. Here, you're basically defined by what you drive, you know. So what makes it tolerable for me here is motorcycles, and motorcycles has ended up playing like a huge role in my life, particularly living here.
Yeah.
You know, you have to go 5 miles, you look at your Waze on your phone, it's, you know, an hour and a half, right? On a motorcycle, you know, the world is your oyster. Like you're able to sort of dissect the city in ways that you can't otherwise.
So let's talk about that a little bit. I know you're a motorcycle guy. James is as well.
What do you ride, James?
Ducati Monster.
I almost could have guessed that. I should have guessed.
Is that right?
I shouldn't even have
Can
asked.
you look at somebody and know
Sometimes.
what they ride?
I'm not that good at it. But
Yeah.
with him, I would have said, my first guess would have been Triumph. I don't know why, but then I would have gone into the Ducati Monster or the Hyper Motard, which is one of my favorite bikes right now. But I could have probably guessed. I would have gotten there eventually. You know?
That's cool.
Yeah.
What was your first bike?
My first bike was in 1972, Kawasaki KZ750 that I bought in New York City. Took the license plate off and parked on the sidewalk, thinking I was one step ahead of Johnny Law. But what I didn't realize is that they found the VIN on it and then wrote me about 400 tickets. So that was a problem.
I guess.
So I just unloaded it one day. But bikes they definitely come and go, but I wish I would. My goal in life is just to have a home, and anyone who knows me knows this story, but my goal in life is to have a home where there's a glass wall between the garage and the house, so I can just sit in my house and just look at them. Like, I get so much pleasure from just looking at those things. There's something about a motorcycle. I don't know what it is, man. You know?
Well, so I want to talk about that because, you know, you started off talking about the value of a bike in terms of transportation, right? Which is not, that's not like typically how bikes are sold, right? And I'm not an expert in it. I've done a little bit of work. We did some work years ago with Yamaha and Star, and kind of, you know, got to learn just the bare minimum.
And
about
were you in the
motorcycle
music biz
business.
doing that?
No, marketing.
Oh, okay. That's right. I know you have a marketing background.
Yeah, and so, right, but you know, there's all of this folklore attached to motorcycles, and this, you know, the easy rider, the open road, the kind of freedom. You know, there's this very masculine Americana attachment that we have to motorcycles, and it feels like all that is changing.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, that feels like a very dated concept, even as we say it, right? And so, and I know you write about this, and so where are we now? What is America's relationship to the motorcycle?
Yeah, what the fuck's up with bikes, right? And it's funny you're asking this because we just came off of the International Motorcycle Show, or IMS as we call it.
Yeah.
And EICMA, those are the two big shows. EICMA's in Milan, IMS is here. And we just did IMS in Long Beach. And so you could argue that Long Beach, SoCal is the epicenter of motorcycle culture, and I would argue that it might be.
Yeah.
But I just came back from New York, and I got to tell you, man, and if the IMS people listen to this podcast, the energy...
They definitely do.
They do? All of them?
Yeah,
all six of them?
We pipe it into their office.
The energy in Long Beach was somewhere here, and in New York City, man, like New Yorkers just sort of bring it, you know?
Really?
I don't know what it was. I was really surprised by that, and I had some great conversations with people there. But here's what's up in the motorcycle space and motorcycles as a business. And I have to be careful how I talk about it too, because I have to take a few swipes at Harley. I'm a huge fan of Harley. I don't ride them. As you know, if you know who Harley guys are, and Harley is an island in the sea of the motorcycle industry. They operate sort of independently. But here's what's up. If you look at the sales trajectory of bikes, it's gone up and down, but now it's just flatlined. So I think it grew 1% last year. So if you're investing, if you're an investor or you want to invest in a growth category, I would advise you to stay away from motorsports, generally speaking. But what's really interesting about it, in my opinion, is that two things are happening right now from a business point of view. One is that Harley, who sells, if you can believe this statistic, and you can fact check me on this, but I think this is pretty accurate, 1 out of every 2 motorcycles in the United States of America that is sold has a Harley Davidson logo on it.
Wow.
1 out of 2.
That's crazy.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So I don't know what their exact revenue is, but it's in the billions. And so their business is kind of slowly contracting for a couple of reasons. One is that their consumers gotten really old. If I say to either one of you guys, what does a Harley guy look like?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to do it? There's range. Well, there's range, yeah. But generally, I'll put it this way. One day I was at I live in Ojai, California, and a lot of motorcyclists come through there, and I saw Ducati Diava. I'm sure I'm saying it the wrong way, but I don't, is that right? Close enough. And it's like a luxury cruiser kind of bike, huge displacement. I don't know, it's 1100 cc's or something. And I'm looking at the bike, and it's pretty. I would never buy one, but it's a pretty bike. And I'm admiring it, and the guy who owns it came out of like a coffee joint. And if I'd seen him inside holding his helmet and his jacket, I'm like, Harley, dude. Huge gut, 50-something years old, gray hair, gray beard, tats, anything you can think of that you would attach to Harley. This guy was checked all the boxes, and he's riding a Ducati. And I'm like, this is your bike? You know, like he's like, why? I'm like, how many bikes do you own? He's like, oh, I own, and all of them are Harleys. This is the first non-Harley bike.
Wow.
That's what's going on in the motorcycle industry.
Yeah.
No one. People who used to buy Harleys are now interested in other bikes. That's a big problem if you're Harley Davidson.
Sure.
And the other problem, I should say the other opportunity is larger displacement bikes. This gets a little boring or a little granular, but large displacement bikes, first of all, they're really heavy. They're hard to ride. I've ridden Harleys. They're not my favorite bikes to ride. If I'm doing long distance, I'll definitely get on one, and I enjoy riding them. I also should say, I used to make fun of those guys riding through LA around the open road with like the radio on 10, and they got like those, you can literally hear those bikes coming from a mile away, and it's usually half radio, half bike.
Yeah.
So I went to Sturgis this past year and got to ride a Electroglide with a radio. It was one of the most fun experiences of my whole life. So here I am hammering Harley, but I actually think they're a ton of fun.
Yeah.
It's a ton of fun to ride. And but my point being is that larger displacement bikes aren't selling as they used to, and so in the used bike market, smaller displacement motorcycles are taking over. And so the question is, why is that happening? Well, one, I would say SoCal kind of drives the scene a bit, and the custom scene here has just gone loco in the past, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. There's a show in Portland called The One Show. There's a show in Austin, Texas called Hand Built. There's a show now in LA. I think it's called Dia. I can't remember the name, but this guy Jay is running it now. It's Dia de la Moto. It's like it's a new custom bike show here in LA. So all these different cities, in New York it's the Brooklyn Invitational. They all have different culture to them, but they're all kind of like reinforcing this culture around, and I mean, the culture around custom built motorcycles is amazing. The culture around motorcycles to me is so fascinating, because the guy who rides a Ducati Monster wears a certain helmet, certain jacket, certain kind of jeans, certain shoes. The guy who rides Harley, same thing. It's all very different. And so what also is now happening is that these larger bikes aren't selling, and in the used market, women, and I would say younger people, are buying smaller displacement bikes, of which Harley does not sell many of them. There's the Sportster, but not everybody wants to ride that bike. So what's going on now is Ducati has come into the market with great bikes. Their sales are up. I don't know, I'm not going to say double digits, but they're up. The Hyper Motard does well. The Monster is like a great bike. I mean, it retails for $8,000, $9,000, so anyone can afford one. But then there's bikes like, and I won't get too into the motorcycle culture, but Husqvarna and KTM, which are kind of, see, he knows what I'm talking about. So there's a bike called the KTM 1090, like Super Adventure, totally just tricked out, cool looking bike, hard bags on it, looks so, and you can take the bags off, rip through LA, put the bags on, and then take it up to Alaska. That's a pretty utilitarian piece of machinery, you know? And then Husqvarna has these two cool bikes. I can't ever pronounce them, but it's like the Vitpillen and the Svartpillen or something. I don't know who the hell names their bikes. I'm sure they're looking for a job right now. But those bikes sell, you know? And I was talking to the KTM guys the other day. I'm like, what's going on with you guys? And they'll brag about it. They're up, if I remember the numbers right, KTM's up 24%. Their sales are up 24% in a category that has just gone completely dead. So how
is that, we talk about changing demographics, right?
Yeah.
We talk about the tanning of America, the feminization of
Yeah.
America.
Yeah.
Again, when we think of Harley and bike culture in general, I think we think of this very white male dominated. Although, I was like amazed to learn in the 90s about Rough Riders and the fact that there's all this black bike culture that I didn't even know existed, right? And so how, when you talk about these brands that are selling and are gaining market share, whatever, how are they adapting to a changing world? And what are they missing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think part of it has to do with the fact that, and I'll pick on a couple brands that have done this well. Since customization has, you were talking about working with Yamaha. I don't even associate Yamaha with a brand that I'd want to customize, but there are brands that actually do a great job of that. And so BMW came out with a bike called the R9T. It's pretty fly looking bike. And I actually borrowed one the other day and was zipping around LA I was at a stoplight, and these two girls were going across the crosswalk, and she did a double take. She's like, "Nice bike." And I'm like, "Wow, man, this thing really does work." But that bike was designed basically to be customized. You know? And so that was, and I'm sure if there's any manufacturer listening to this podcast, they're saying, "Well, dude, like pretty much every bike on the market's ripe to be customized," and I would agree, Harley especially. So that almost begs the question, so what are they doing wrong that everybody else is doing right? Yeah. And I think part of it is just driven by the fact that, motorcycle culture is in fact, it's the sort of the culture within the culture because it's so segmented, for a guy who rides a Ducati, he's not inclined to, he probably is going to stay sort of in that ecosystem. Like, everybody wants to say they have a Ducati. There's something about saying you have that bike. Sure. And this gets back again into like the story of the brand and like what goes on behind the scenes of like that particular brand and how it resonates with different people. Sorry, but your question was about like, what are these brands doing to like...
Yeah, to be culturally relevant.
Well, I think the relevance or the like sort of impact that I think is happening in the market now is happening in, again, like in the what I was talking about earlier with like the custom scene, and also there's sort of like another pocket of it that I find really interesting. It seems to be very personality based. Like I think that's where a lot of the sort of activation happens in the motorcycle space. So there's this dude out of SoCal named Roland Sands. He knows Roland Sands. He made his name building pretty cool custom bikes. Then he kind of made a name for himself. He had like a apparel line that does pretty well. I see it all the time. I don't own any of it, but it always looks really nice. But the thing I find really interesting about him and his brand is that he sort of has connected himself to this sort of hooligan race series, flat track racing. So flat track racing, it's like a quarter-mile track. You go around in a circle. You just basically go to the left for about 20 minutes, just racing around a track. And what's really interesting about it is that you wear a metal boot on your, I guess would be on your left foot or your right foot. I got to think about this for a second.
Probably your left.
Yeah. And as you're ripping around this, it's incredibly dangerous, as you might imagine. And they're like 700 to 750 to like 900 cc bikes. They're big bikes. When guys wipe out, man, you're getting hit. Like, it's no joke. I took my 14-year-old daughter to a race, and she's like, "That was the most fun that I've ever had." And you're getting hit with dirt. I mean, it's like you're really engaged in the event. But the crowd that goes to that, it's definitely kind of like a SoCal moto crowd, a little rough around the edges, But that hooligan series, it's really interesting to me because first of all, just the name hooligan is great, and it's definitely like the kind of guy who races hooligan is like, you have to have absolutely no fear to do any type of motorcycle racing, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I've been on a track, I've done a track day, but you're out there by yourself and you're racing, like, you're not smashing into a guy at 185 miles per hour, Right. But the hooligan series to me is like that is like sort of one area of from like a marketing perspective that, like, as a guy, like, obviously I'm 50 years old, and like, how do I connect with like a 20-year-old person in motorsports? And hooligan racing seems to be that one area where everything does seem to cross over, and you can really connect with sort of like what is happening in the sport. Women don't race flat track, but they probably could. Actually, I've never women in motorcycling is kind of a phenomenon unto itself because not a ton of women seem to ride. When you go to events, there are a lot of women there. I think it's something like there's 13 million motorcyclists in the U.S. and maybe 10% are women. When I was talking about earlier about like where the business is heading and smaller displacement bikes, a lot of that's driven by women. There are bikes that are on the market that, you know, I'm sure I'll take heat for saying this, but what do I care? The Sportster, which is Harley's smallest model, people have always told me that's a woman's bike, although I don't necessarily believe that, but that's sort of like what people say about them. But I've ridden with women who, you know, anyone can twist a throttle. It's limiting the fear factor in your head. And I've ridden with women who seem to have tamped that down and can rip on a track. You know?
Well, I'm sure that's true, and I also think a lot of it is identity, right? That do people see themselves, like, again, if we have a certain perspective of what a cyclist looks like, what a rider looks like, then do I see myself in that role, right? Does that suit my identity?
Right. And I think historically, like, you know, when you ask people about the motorcycle industry, like it's Marlon Brando and the Wild Ones and all that stuff, there's a lot of baggage with it, and Hell's Angels and, you know, the Mongrels and moto gangs. And, you know, at the end of the day, like, I guess that's, you know, there's a rebel quality to it, and I can't say that, like, that doesn't appeal to me in some way, because it does, I suppose. But I think the part that really is interesting, and I should say like engaging or amazing, is at the end of the day, man, you've taken a motor, you've stripped away all the pieces, you're not in a safe box, you don't have the air conditioning on, you're sitting there, you've stripped all the pieces away, you've then taken that motor, shoved it between your legs, and then you're sticking yourself out on the 405 freeway, going, in most cases, faster than you probably should be, battling the boxes, as I call them, because that's what it is, and someday the boxes are kind, and on most day they're not, you know. And when shit goes wrong out there, it goes wrong fast. And, you know, I've seen, I don't want to get into the gory details of it, we've all seen stuff that's really sort of disconcerting and upsetting. And, you know, as the expression goes, there's two kind of motorcyclists in the world, those who have gone down and those who you know, have not yet. And I'm both of those at this point. Like I've definitely wiped out, but not on the street. So you're riding an explosive device between your legs. So that's definitely part of the sort of interest of riding a bike. Sure. But I've written about it, and I think I sent you that article, sort of when we were trying to figure out how to conduct this discussion.
It hasn't gone at all according to plan.
I know. I'm realizing that. It's okay.
No, I'm just kidding. This is great.
But the part about, I have all these life lessons that I've taken away. I actually wrote them down today because as we were talking about, I'm like, I'm not even sure I remember like even what I wrote, you know. So I had to,
what do you got over there?
Well, I literally went back and looked at them because I had to like think about like, you know, I know the listeners who listen to this podcast, they want knowledge, like they want to be able to take stuff away from these interviews, you know. So I went back and looked at it, and it was basically, here are the 7 things, it was actually 6 things, right, that you need, the 6 things I've learned from riding motorcycles.
Oh, cool.
And this is in the article, and I'll rattle through them, and then you can ask me any questions about them if it's even interesting. But the one thing, I'm actually going to start at the bottom, because I learned this from Richard Branson, right? So I'm a big, like you, you consume a lot of podcasts, or consume a lot of media. But I listened to a podcast with Richard Branson, and he talked about when he was working on Virgin Records, they got into like all kinds of financial distress. And it's just amazing, that guy flipped a record company, parlayed it into an airline when the record industry was booming when he sold that thing. And everyone thought he was an idiot. And look, I mean, just brilliant, the move that guy made. I think about that all the time. I'm sure every single person told him, do not do this, and he did it and went into the airline business. But he talked about when he got in financial distress that he had to spend his way out. And so I always thought that was really interesting, because when companies get in, even when I was at Nike, like when there was I was there during the child labor era, when, you know, kids in factories, and that was like obviously a very touchy subject. And sales definitely took a dip, and one of the first things we did was spend our way out of it. And so that was one of the things I wrote down, was more throttle, less brake, you know? Like when shit goes south sometimes, like if you've ever ridden dirt, when the bike is unstable and the back wheel's kind of going all over the place, if you give it more gas, it straightens everything out. And so I think about that. It works in business sometimes, you know, when something isn't feeling right, when shit's going off the rails, sometimes just by applying more pressure or by applying more acceleration, by applying more spending, or by applying more pressure to your sales force, you can sometimes get a desired result, you know?
So how do you learn to do that, right? I'm not a motorcyclist. I've ridden a few times, but I ride mountain bike, road bike, right? And when you're potentially going down, like when the bike gets unstable, the last thing on anyone's mind is to hit the throttle, right? Is to go forward.
Right. You think you should go slower so you can stick your feet out, or
absolutely.
That's the death wish, man.
For sure. And so, and I get that as an analogy for business and life.
Yeah.
How do you train yourself to do that?
Yeah, and the answer to that is I don't know, but I can tell you this: like
cool.
when it's like fight or flight. I was riding with a guy one time in Vermont. I lived in Vermont for a year or two, and we went out riding one day, and we kind of got split up, and we met at anytime you split up, you always sort of pick a spot where you can reunite. And I was riding with this dude from work who had a Ducati Monster, and we came around this corner, and I lost him, and I caught up to him later, covered in blood, not his. I'm like, dude, like, what happened? And we were riding on this country road, some dog came out of nowhere, and he's like, I had absolutely no time to think, but he said my first reaction was just to gun it, because if I slow the bike down, I'm gonna crash. The dog's gonna get hit either way.
Right.
So I accelerated through the dog, and he said he split it in half.
Oh my God.
And it was just like, there were literally chunks of dog on his, sorry, there's a couple dog lovers
story
in here probably. So we kind of picked the dog pieces off his bike, and it's a great story, but I can tell you the one or two times in my life where an animal has come in front of me. Once I hit the brake and once I hit the gas. And nothing serious happened either way. But I think about the dog story a lot when I'm out there. So a lot of times, and this gets into my other one, so that's a good segue, which is the number one thing that I wrote was, what is behind you is just as important as what's in front of you. So when you're out riding a bike, I'm checking my side, what's behind me, as much as I'm checking what's in front of me. Because, and if there are any teenage girls listening, I don't apologize for this. If I see a teenage girl or a young woman, and I don't care if any woman takes me for task on this, I don't care, I really don't. If I see a young woman on the freeway and she has a phone in her hand, I tend to accelerate away from her or drop back, because they're always a little bit all over the place, they're a little bit skittish. And so metaphorically, in your life, you make these decisions. We started talking at the very beginning about these micro decisions you make in your life that affect you. You have to remember those decisions, because just because it's behind you, it still affects what's going on in your life, and like what is going to happen ahead of you in your life is still connected to the decisions you've made behind you, you know. The dog story doesn't really play into that, but I can tell you that when I ride on freeways in LA, and I do it way too often than I probably should, I'm hyper. It's not even like, and you know this, it's not even like you're really enjoying yourself out there half the time. Half the time you're doing the calculus in your head. Fuck, what's that guy? I got pulled over by the police one day for going 85, and I couldn't believe the guy wrote me a ticket. He's like, why were you going so fast? I'm like, I wasn't going fast. I said I was searching for my little safe pocket on the freeway, and you just happened to catch me as I pulled into my space. You should be thanking me for being a safe guy, so you don't have to scrape me off the freeway. He didn't think that was funny, and I went to traffic school, and it's all fixed. But I do think about, like, that was my number one when I wrote that article. That was the first thing I was thinking about, is what is behind you. You always have to look at what's behind you all the time.
So to go back to what we talked about at the beginning of this with entrepreneurship and failure, and so how does this rule kind of play into that?
Well, because, that's a good question. Do you ever notice people say that's a good question? They're usually trying to think of, like...
Yeah, you're buying yourself time. That's great.
So you know that trick?
No, it's smart because you pay the person a compliment. So I'm sitting here thinking about how smart I am for that great question I asked, and that gives you time to think of the answer.
John said 10 times today, good question. He clearly was ill-prepared for this discussion. All right, what was the question again? It was how does that number one fit into the
this idea of what's behind us, right? How does that impact this idea of what's, of how we think about failure and how we think about entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the Phil Knight version, right, which is these unbelievably tricky decisions that he had to navigate. Again, like, do I sign Jordan? Do I sign Ewing? Like, you always reflect back on those decisions, and so great, you sign Jordan, you build a $1 company, great decision. If he'd signed Ewing, would you and I be sitting here talking about Phil Knight? Maybe not, you know? So you have to consider that stuff. Or another entrepreneurial icon of mine, Jake Burton, you know, rest in peace. He just died at 65, and really good boss. And, you know, he, I mean, I don't really know his entrepreneurial path. I know that he taught, well, this actually does kind of answer the question. He taught tennis in Manhattan to sort of fund the company in the early days.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, he you know, I knew him, but I, you know, I was definitely not in his inner circle, but I, you know, knew him. He was my boss for a while. He was definitely by any means necessary kind of guy. Like anyone who was willing to like, he didn't just start a business. He invented a category. He invented a sport.
Yeah.
You know, as an adult.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I doubt any of us have the ability to have that kind of like foresight and to build a, you know, I don't know what the revenue of Burton is. It's about $350 million when I was there. I'm sure it's twice the size of that now.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, he went through his ups and downs for sure. But yeah, I think and then I'll even throw, you know, my father into it. My dad was an entrepreneur. He was a sort of small town businessman, owned a chain of retail stores. He made some really good decisions in his life and made some horrible ones at the same time. And, you know, sitting around the dinner table with him at night, like I wouldn't say it was like you know, he wasn't distilling the secrets of the universe through the eyes of a retail entrepreneur. But I remember we sat around the table one night. It was kind of funny, and his business did okay throughout the years, but there's this thing that came out, and I don't know, the 80s, we'll call it what it was, like the catalog started. You guys remember the J. Crew catalog?
Yeah, sure.
And you know, and it really affected my dad's business. You know, he was in the soft goods business. Oh, yeah. And I remember when it was time for him to sell the business, he came to me, he was like, what do you want to do? You want to buy into this business or not? And I didn't really want to live in a small town. I wasn't really interested in being in that line of business. And I said, Dad, the catalog business is eventually going to eat up retail as we know it. This goes to show you, like, the internet had yet to even be invented. So could you imagine, like, I don't know what year, this is probably in the 90s, having that conversation, not even knowing like what was ahead of us. So looking back on it, I mean, now I feel like anyone who's in the retail business, I was just in Manhattan, as I was telling you, and a lot of storefronts are empty. I walked up to visit a buddy on the Upper East Side. I was walking up Madison Avenue. There are empty storefronts 2 blocks from the mansion where Ralph Lauren's famous store is. You know, that was never even possible a few years ago. So retail business is, in my opinion, a disaster. I think if you're in like the restaurant business, like that's a good business now because that's never going to be replaced by the internet. You sitting down and having good food made by human hands and having a conversation with somebody. You know, we were walking over here and Blue Bottle's around the corner, and I'm a huge fan of what those guys do. As a matter of fact, I was just talking about, I used Blue Bottle as a business model to raise $1 million to start a coffee business.
Nice.
I think that was part of my story as well.
Yeah.
And I technology, as amazing as it is, and as much as it's really confronting for me, partially because I have teenage daughters and they're constantly looking at their phones, and I find that to be like, it's such a hard part of like, because we never had that stuff growing up, you know, but we're on our shit all the time. So I really feel like the technology, as much as it's laying waste to our society, it's also, you know, it's still going to allow business like Blue Bottle being a great example. Like as much as technology continues to proliferate into our lives, sitting across the table from somebody and drinking a really decent cup of coffee and the story behind that coffee, like to me, that's really interesting. You know, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're talking about motorcycles.
No, this is great.
I took you off course.
No, I love it. And, you know, I think, you know, when you talk about technology, I think we're confronted more now than ever with this idea of taking the good with the bad, right? That you know, the automobile has had catastrophic effects on the environment, on humanity, right? There's caused more death and all that, but we don't really think about that. We generally think about having cars in our lives is a great thing, or having the option to drive from place to place is a great thing. You know, we think about the stories of before cars existed to now, right? But, you know, maybe part of that is because it's ancient history or whatever the reason is. But I think, you know, technology, you know, digital technology is corollary to that, except we're hyper aware of both the good and the bad on a daily basis, right? And you know, you can't have a conversation with people who either aren't so excited about their new app or phone or whatever thing they just discovered, or how fucked up everything is that no one looks each other in the eye and and I think on both sides there's like wild exaggeration and also lots of truth and all of that, but it's consuming to us as a society, just our thoughts about our relation to that in ways that we've never had before.
And I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions here, but I'm going to do it anyway because you didn't tell me there are any rules, so I like to just make shit up as I go along.
Yeah.
So do you feel like technology has expanded your relationships with people or has detracted from them?
Both. I would say in general it's been more good than bad.
Yeah.
So it gives me the opportunity to, and I was going to ask you about this, although James is telling me we're running out of time, but...
Don't listen to James.
I know, he's the worst.
Okay. I drives a Ducati, what does he know?
Shit, I forgot what I was going to say. So, technology gives me the ability to keep in touch with people, keep tabs on people I'm interested in, stay in touch with friends and family and business people that I would like to, and it just makes it a lot easier, exponentially easier. And so, but I was wondering, you've talked about people that have been important or influential in your life, Chuck McBride, other people like that. How do you either, keep in touch with those people or keep that, just keep those relationships alive?
Yeah, I don't actually.
Cool. Good story.
At all. Yeah, I'm terrible at it. I find that it's funny that I never planned on talking about Chuck McBride today, but it's funny that that's one name that came up, and I didn't plan on talking about him. But what I'm finding is the same thing you are, is like, and let's just pick on Instagram, because I could first of all, I wish I could just get rid of all this stuff. Like everyone says, oh, I'm not on Facebook. We're all on it, of course. We may not post stuff on it.
But Facebook's on us.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a really good way of looking at it. And I just read today that, Google tracks everywhere that you go. And I just kind of look at it as the double whammy. I mean, I love Waze, and I love the fact that everyone who's opening up Waze is creating this sort of collective intelligence around how to get around LA, which, let's be honest, like we all need help getting around this place.
Absolutely.
Without it, we'd all be nothing. On the flip side of it, the anxiety that it creates in our culture, and I'm dealing with that right now in my own life with, someone in my family who I think spends too much time on the phone, and you have kids, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And I think with teenage girls, it's particularly divisive. We're not going to solve that problem today, unfortunately. But what I really find in the stuff that I get excited about, which essentially is, motorcycles and snowboarding, which are two activities that really resonate with me, is that I can kind of learn about, like, oh, this guy just built this cool custom bike, and there's this design idea behind it, and you can kind of like go down the rabbit. Like, that's just, there's nothing better than that, man. Like, I can basically study an entire culture of the business culture that I'm in through an app. I met a guy in the art business who said, I have the art world dialed through Instagram.
Yeah.
Because you can just curate this whole thing.
Absolutely.
There's nothing getting away from that, man. Like, I think that's really an important thing. But I think we're just fucked as a culture, generally speaking, like how much importance we place behind it. And then, like, getting back to the relationships part of it, we all say that we have these good friends. I've been living in LA now for, I think it's like coming up on 18 years. A lot of my friends are still back on the East Coast. I have some friends here in LA. I don't spend enough time hanging out with those guys. It's hard to make, especially I think when you're a dude, and you guys back me up on this, I think it's harder to make relationships in your adult years. It's much more difficult to maintain a meaningful relationship with another male adult your age, versus when you're like 24 or 25, you just go out and grab a beer, and it just felt lighter, easier. But when you have like job and kids,
everyone's too busy. Like myself included, like there's just too much shit that needs to be done,
and there's too much choice, and then we shouldn't spin out on that. But like even like the media landscape, there's too much choice.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's the reason why I like In-N-Out Burger so much. I don't really eat that much. When you go in, it's like you get three things, dude. And back to Trader Joe's. So the reason why I like Trader Joe's, you go in there, man. You want to buy toilet paper. There's two kinds.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
there's something about that that's just really appealing. And I think,
Totally.
you know, I'm working on this project right now. We're trying to get people to opt into like this idea of a motorcycle subscription. And I think one of the hard parts about that is, you know, you pay a flat fee and you get to ride whatever bike, but then there's 400 bikes. Okay, so now
Right.
what bike do you pick, you know?
Yeah.
So I feel like that's part of what sucks about technology is that there's just,
Yeah, too much choice.
there's an incredible amount of it.
Absolutely.
And it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to bring it back to
Yeah, give us one more rule,
my
and then I
last-
got to get to a lightning round.
my last one. All right, I'll go with this one, and well, no, I'm going to skip that one. I think my second one was, and this is kind of what we talked about too, is, and how you're, you know, it's not so much around relationships, but target fixation, right? So that's a big problem when you're riding a motorcycle, right? If you just focus on one thing, you tend to crash into it. So I think it's good to have like, almost like having your head on a swivel. Like, you know, I talked about what's in front of you is just as important as what's behind you. It's also important, even in your own personal life and in your own personal relationships, not to target fixate on one thing or that thing just expands, you know? So, you know, if you're in a tough spot with your lady, it's probably good to like sort of talk about what the issue is between you. But if you're constantly like going, edging in on that one thing, nothing good is going to come out of that, you know? And I think that's exaggerated, getting back to the technology piece. I think that's heavily exaggerated on social media, like people sort of like picking apart things, you know? I was just about to make another negative comment about a motorcycle brand and decided I was going to cut myself. You can edit that part out anyway, man. I know you can do that.
So bring that back to entrepreneurship, right? Because there's, you know, again, there's this I believe it's a myth in the discussion of entrepreneurship that what a lot of these people are doing is they're packing the work of a 40-year career into 4 years.
Yeah.
Right. Build a company, huge, fast, exit.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that's complete bullshit. That it actually doesn't work that way, that there are elements of those processes that you can't accelerate.
Correct.
But the argument with, like, you know, if people buy into that idea, it's exactly what you're talking about. It's target fixation, right? It's staying laser focused on a particular goal is said to be the answer.
Right. Right. The big audacious goal, right? I
Yeah.
want to be a $40 billion company. Anything else short of that, somebody once said to me that when you're setting goals for yourself or for a company, particularly for a company, you should set a goal so big you can't achieve it in your lifetime.
Right.
I don't know how I feel about that, you know. You know, my own personal philosophy is I believe that I sort of buy into the idea of being the master in the art of living, where your work and your life are somewhat indistinguishable, you know. I've been able to achieve that in some areas of my life. In snowboarding, I worked for Jake for a while, and motorcycling for the past 5 or 10 years, I'm in sort of dabbling in that. And that feels really important to me, you know. I feel like if you're, you know, it's I don't want to get into the cliche part of it. Like, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life. I think that's bullshit.
That's bullshit too.
Yeah, it's total bullshit, because it's.
Thank you for that.
Sorry.
No.
And you still have to go to the grocery store. You still have to drop your kid. There's stuff you got to do. You don't always want, you know.
Well, and also, like, part of any great job sucks.
Yes, it does.
And, you know, you still have to fire people. You still have to worry about payroll. You still have to haggle with insurance or whatever, right? There's no such thing as it not being work just because you are sold on the outcome.
Yeah.
Or you enjoy parts of it, whatever.
Or you have to edit an interview to make a guy sound really interesting. That's hard work, man. You know?
Not for me. It's easy for me because James does it.
Thanks, James. Be kind over there, man.
Okay, lightning round.
So lightning round, you ask questions and I have to sound like I've thought, I just let it
No,
fly.
because he'll edit out the long pauses.
Oh,
while
he will? Okay.
While you stumble. We might.
So I can say, that's a really good question.
Yep.
James is like, James, what was that bike you had before your Ducati? What was it?
That was my first bike.
Your first bike? Wow, you jumped right in.
I mean, I was riding other people's bikes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And it's not the new one. I got an old one.
Yeah, never buy a new bike. No reason.
We should never buy a new car either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes even less sense to buy a new bike.
Yeah.
It's the one with the drag clutch. I like, you know, I don't like it reliable.
I just love that sound.
Broad knob.
Yeah, just the if you're out drinking coffee and a guy pulls up on a dry clutch Ducati, you can see it, you can hear it, you can smell it. There's something just nice about it.
Loose change.
Yeah, loose change.
So, okay, real quick on that before we get to the lightning round.
Yes.
Because I know you're an advocate for electric motorcycles.
My goal in this project I'm working on now is to make Los Angeles an electric two-wheel community. Like, that is a big, audacious goal that I will not achieve in my lifetime, and I'm okay with that.
But you can make strides towards it.
But I will make strides towards it. I think.
So
it's such
just
a
on that
fascinating
though, I know there's debate about this. I know it's in the car business and motorcycles, but and you just mentioned the sound of the Ducati. So electric bikes don't have the sound.
Nope.
How do we get over that?
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts on that. One is that it's funny. I have an electric car, and I was driving it through a parking lot the other day, and this woman was like talking on her phone, just was walking in front of me, and I'm like, didn't want to horn her.
Right.
So like, what do you do? So I think car companies, if you're listening, you need to put a feature in the car that's like, or maybe like what cops have, it's like, hey lady, like something to like cue people, like get your head out of your ass. It would be really great to when electric motorcycles proliferate, and they will. There is going to need to be some type of sound component to those bikes, because it is a real problem. Now, when you're when you're lane splitting on the freeway, and you've been on the freeway when some guy comes by and has clipped your mirror or something, that's already dangerous to itself. It doesn't really need to apply to that, because that whirring sound those bikes make. The Harley Livewire just came out this year. Yeah. And you can hear that thing. Like it has that zzz, you can really, it's not a dry clutch Ducati for sure. It's definitely not that potato sound that a Harley has, but it makes a sound, I'm not involved, I don't have any product development connections in the motorcycle industry, but I will tell you that with technology and integration into smartphones, you should be able, this is a business maybe you and I should do. We should invent an app that allows you to upload sounds you can put on your phone, and then you buy the hardware and you install it onto your motorcycle. So when you're in LA traffic and someone pisses you off, you can give them like the blow horn, or something. Like we need to. So we can't solve that problem today, but electric bikes will proliferate. But the sound is definitely something that's going to have to. Someone will add a sound. To the bike. The Zero guys make great bikes. They're incredibly quiet machines. We're gonna, they have horns on them, but that's not.
Which I think there's a safety issue, but there's also there's that emotional connection people have to the sound of a certain engine, or the rumble of it, right, is part of the rider experience.
For sure. When there's this guy named Carlin Dunn, who's a professional motorcycle racer. Rest in peace. He died this past year at Pikes Peak, and he was telling me that one of the difficulties of racing electric bikes versus internal combustion is that the engine screams. It tells you when to shift the bike. Right. There's no shifting on an electric bike. You're literally just twisting your wrist. And so it's a little bit harder to have that relationship with the bike, and how much you've wound it up, and when you move it or shift it, or it's just a different experience. I don't race bikes at 185 miles per hour, so it's difficult for me to talk about that. But by the way, there is an electric motorcycle race series now attached to MotoGP. So it's not broadcast on TV, unfortunately, but it's really interesting. And I was talking to the CEO at the motorcycle show, whose bike was the bike picked to be they all race on the same bike. Cool. So it was really interesting. He was telling me all about that.
Okay, lightning round. Go. What's your favorite city to travel to?
My favorite city to travel to? Can I say two? Copenhagen, in Denmark. You can walk 20 feet in any direction and eat the best smoked fish you'll ever have on the planet. Yeah, it's great. I just love it. And then my best friend on the planet, New York City. I told someone asked me, like, what do you like about New York City? It's the place that pushes you down on the street and punches you in the face and kicks you, and then 20 minutes later will lift you up and make you feel like $1 million, and it happens in a span of 20 minutes. That's funny. Something about New York is able to do that. All right. Well, I know you said you're not a music guy, and I know you were also a DJ. So, do you have a favorite DJ? Yes. This is a canned answer because you interviewed him. Oh. DJ Vice. I call him Eric. Yeah. DJ Vice. Love Vice. He also. It's not because he gave me a really expensive bottle of tequila as a gift, although that might have something to do with it. I'm not heavy in the club scene, or I love going to Vegas, And hopefully Vice will hear this podcast and he'll hook me up with some tickets. But yes, next time we're all in Vegas, I'm going to take us to. I want to see him play because I'm such a huge fan of his, and he's such a cool guy. And we have a really interesting connection, which I'll tell you about on another podcast.
He's an amazing DJ, great guy. Good combination.
He's like, when I met him, I couldn't. I said, "What do you do, man?" He's like, "Oh, I'm a DJ." And I figured, like what? On like radio station? Like, what do you mean? And then when he told me what he did, and I was looking at his Instagram, I'm like, "Wow, you really are, man.
Sure,
you've really accomplished something with your career."
That's great. What's the last great book you read?
I'm reading one now, and I couldn't even tell you the name of it because I listened to it on Audible.
Yeah.
What was the last book I read? Oh, it was, my God, I can't even think of the guy's name. Ryan, it was about the ego is your enemy.
Oh, Ryan Holiday.
Ryan Holiday.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of his.
I like him, definitely. You know, he's a young dude, and so I like to hear from the young guns, like what's going on out there. I like his whole series of books, and his philosophy is interesting, and we all struggle with our ego. I have some ideas on how people can crush their ego, and that's definitely not something I can squeeze into a lightning round. But that book it definitely resonated with me, and I annotated in it. I was so interested in it, so that was
nice.
That was a great book.
Cool. Well, we're gonna have you back and teach us how to crush the ego. What movie have you seen the most in your life?
Reservoir Dogs.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I take that back. There's two answers. Reservoir Dogs, because it was such an intense script and also felt more like a play than a movie. But again, going back to the original genesis of this discussion, I've seen Purple Rain about 300 times.
Oh, wow.
And finally got to watch it with my teenage daughters who kind of like cringed. It's hard watching like sex stuff with your kids. And there's that scene where Prince gets over on Apollonia, and it's kind of not that terribly graphic.
Sure.
Great movie, man. That movie holds up after all these years. I could watch that movie. We should watch it when this is over. We should go and find a place. It's got to be playing somewhere in LA.
I'm down. What style of yours are you glad is behind you and not on social media?
That's just a weird question. That's not a good like a fashion style kind of thing.
Yeah, like you had.
Okay. Well, first of all, I still wear I don't know what you call it, like the alligator shirts, right? So I used to always pop my collar up on them back in the day.
Nice.
And I still wear them because somehow, I don't know if they're back, but to me they're back because I still wear them. And I had when I wear them, I always put my collar up, and my teenage daughters are just aghast. The fact that it pisses them off means that so if I have a polo shirt on, my collar's up. But so it kind of it's not really the answer to your question.
No, it's a good one though. I like it anyway. What's the last thing you stole?
Seriously, like the last thing I stole.
Can you remember?
Yeah, it was probably a bottle of booze.
Oh, nice.
From a friend's house.
Yeah, that's cool. That's worth stealing.
Yeah, I went to a party, and I brought a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
But there's a really good bottle of tequila there, and I overheard him saying, he's like, I'm not a huge fan of tequila. And someone had taken, like, it was like that Casa de Amigos, which I really love. And so I drank it out back, and then I put it in my car.
Lori, what's the last thing you stole?
The last thing I did steal.
Okay.
I got a package I ordered something from Nordstrom.
Yeah.
Like this past couple of weeks, and it said it was delivered to my doorstep, and it didn't show up at my doorstep.
Yeah.
And so I was charged for it. So I called them, and they canceled the order, and then it showed up a week later. And I called them, and I said they had taken it off my account.
Right.
And I said, you have to charge me again because it showed up.
Oh,
so
wow.
I didn't steal it.
You are exceedingly honest.
That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Karma, it was a good thing to do.
Oh, my God.
I would have just kept it.
I did keep it.
I mean, if I wanted it, like I would have just kept it and not. I wouldn't have called them to.
There are times in my life where I wouldn't have, but I felt like it was better for me to.
You are the morally superior person in this room.
At this moment in time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the last thing you stole?
Ah, man, I thought about when I wrote this question down. I need to know the answer for myself. I don't know, but there was a time, around high school, college, when we used to just sort of steal stuff from time to time, like You know, I had friends that were like serious, like boosters, and they go to Banana Republic and
Wow.
like jack a bunch of clothes in their
Yeah.
thing and whatever. And I remember one time I was like, I went somewhere with my mom, and I snagged like a T-shirt or whatever. So this is a long time ago, but and you know, and I showed it to her after, and she's like, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Like, and I don't know what I expected her to say,
That was nuts.
but yeah, it wasn't that.
Do you also, when you go to Whole Foods, do you eat out of the bin?
Oh, I know the last thing I saw when I was in college.
Yeah.
I went to UCLA, and you'd go in the cafeteria, and right at the front, at the checkout, they would have chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah.
And I would always just walk in there, grab a chocolate chip cookie, and then go get my lunch, and I would pay for the lunch and not the cookie.
I did that at Whole Foods.
Oh, yeah.
Recently with a scone.
Yeah.
And I just was eating and shopping, and I usually pay for it because I'm so honest.
Right.
But I forgot, and I got out to the car, and I'm like, "Ooh, I just stole the scone."
And you went back in and paid for it.
I didn't pay for it.
So,
God.
so the Nordstrom thing you were making up for.
What? No. It's a balance. It's
Wow,
about
Laura,
balance.
you're too honest to be interesting on a podcast, that's for sure.
If I worked for you, what's something I would hear you say over and over?
Fuck you. That's the first thing that came to my mind.
Nice.
What would be the thing you hear most coming out of my mouth?
Yeah.
Probably be talking about, I work right now in a company that has coffee, and the coffee sucks, so I tend to complain a lot about the coffee all day, so I'm always talking about how important coffee
Not
is.
your coffee business.
No, not my coffee
Okay.
business. No,
That would
it's different.
be
It's
a
totally
problem
different.
if the coffee
That
sucked.
would be an issue.
Just an office with bad coffee.
Yeah, an office of bad coffee. I try and prescribe to this thing where you try and go 24 hours without saying something negative or complaining. And
Wow.
I know, and then when you mess up, you got to start all over again. And I try and do that once in a great while. Like every week or two, I'll try and like do it. And the only time I remove it, if I drink coffee and it sucks, I feel like I'm allowed to talk about. It's like quality control more than just complaining.
Sure.
So, coffee and saying the word "fuck you" are two big things in my life. Yeah.
Nice. John, thanks for doing this. This is a fun
We're
interview.
done. That's it.
We
nothing else
are
to talk
kicked
about.
out, but we'd love to have you back.
Let's come back and talk about ego. I have a whole a whole rambling monologue I can do about.
We'll just give you the mic. I'm going to leave, and you can just go.
She's heard the story. It's yeah.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
How should people find you?
This is where I plug myself.
Yeah.
I just probably Instagram is probably the easiest way if they want to see what's going on in my head.
And a lot of your writings on Medium.
My writing's on Medium.
Yeah.
My blog, I write for a motorcycle blog called The Bullet.
Oh, cool.
And it's spelled with 2 L's and 2 T's. I'm on Instagram as Johnny Lewis, which is what my friends back home call me. I go by John, which is fine. You can call me John. People who know me call me Johnny.
Cool.
And that's probably the simplest way to hook up with me.
Right on, man.
And if anybody out there has bootleg Prince videos, then hit me up because I'd like to see them.
Oh, cool. And that was John Lewis on Rebel Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Make sure you hit us on iTunes with a 5-star review. Hit us on Twitter at Rebel Radio Net. Hit us on Facebook at Rebel Radio Net. Tell us what's up. Tell us, you know what? We got our 5th year anniversary coming up. Rebel Radio's been on the show 5 years come this June. Love to hear your ideas about what we should do to celebrate. Should we have a party? Should we have a special guest? Should we have a party with a special guest? I don't know. It could be crazy. You tell me. Let us know what you want to do. And most importantly, come back next week for more Rebel Radio. Peace.